professor. Professor Richmond was just saying he hasn't been up here since the Hemp Fest. He doesn't really remember exactly.
I don't remember too much, but I know I was up there.
So this is actually Boston's first Civil War monument, done in I think 1881, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, said that he didn't like it. He said they got it all wrong. They don't have the real purpose of the war. And men of Boston who died for their country on land and sea in the war, which kept the Union whole, destroyed slavery, maintained the Constitution. Now, this monument is in need of about $10+ million worth of restoration. There used to be soldiers and sailors on these pedestals here. About 2 years ago, one of them fell off, and someone thought, gee, the rest might fall off too. We'll take them off in case they fall. While Professor Richmond is here after the Hemp Fest, or I'm here haranguing a group, and one of us gets killed, and so the soldiers and sailors are not here. And you see on the very top, of course, is Liberty, or the statue, the woman with a flag, soldiers and sailors protecting her. And then around the base are these smaller panels of bas-relief of scenes from the war. So you have, here are the soldiers leaving for war. One side has them leaving, one side has them coming back, and then there are scenes of the home front on one side and scenes of the battle on the other. So they have different scenes from the war. I should also point out that inside the State House there is a monument to the nurses of the war, and this is the first monument to women in the Civil War in the country. It's inside the State House.
Was that put up in the 19th century?
That was in the 19th century, yeah, the nurses monument. And these are all actual figures, again, like the Shaw Memorial. So here is Governor Andrew, the local minister, Massachusetts regiment leaving, and a woman with a child seeing the soldiers off. So this is the party going off to the war. And I should point out, this is in front of the state. Governor Andrew standing on the steps of the State House. There are 3 times when we open the doors to the State House, the central doors, when a visiting dignitary or head of state comes to town, when the governor leaves office and he walks out the doors and becomes a private citizen, or when a Massachusetts regiment leaves or comes back. They are presented their colors, or they return their colors coming back from the war. So here you see one of these scenes, the men leaving for war, the governor seeing them off. Let me move around and see what we can see on the other side. This is actually another very important part of Boston's role in the war. These are, again, just as we have a monument to the nurses, early on in the war, President Lincoln wanted to set up a sanitary commission to keep the camps clean and also care for the wounded. Because until the 20th century, the biggest killer of men in the military was disease or infection, not bullet wounds, camp fever and other things. So the Civil War began with an expectation that maybe we can stop that. So here you see U.S. Sanitary Commission, and the head of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, anyone know? Samuel Ridley Howe, who was the proprietor of the Perkins School for the Blind, was one of the best known health guys in the country, even though he ran a school for the blind and the deaf. Very well known because Laura Bridgman was the first deaf-blind person to learn how to communicate. She came as a child to the school from New Hampshire and learned how to communicate using sign language. And later on, the Perkins School is where Helen Keller later came to learn how to communicate. So Howe was an internationally famous authority on most things. He was also kind of a pretentious guy.
He had a famous wife.
He had a very famous wife. Now, they were also abolitionists. Before the war, John Brown, the Perkins School was in South Boston, And his wife, Julia Wardhowe, remembered John Brown coming to see them, and they published a journal called Commonwealth, which was an anti-slavery journal. And then they were very excited when the war began because they knew this would be a war about slavery. And then, as I said earlier, the Massachusetts troops going through Baltimore were attacked by a mob. Some of them were killed. The bodies were brought back. And Julia Wardhowe and her husband went to the funeral at King's Chapel. And suddenly they see these flag-draped caskets. And they knew this war was going to cost a lot of lives. That was a somber reflection. This war, they had celebrated. They had tried to promote. They knew that the war would bring the end of slavery. Now they knew they weren't going to be the ones dying in this war. And what did this mean? Now, in the fall of that year, the president asked Samuel Gridley Howe to come to Washington to organize the Sanitary Commission, and he and Mrs. Howe went down to Washington. And what really struck her on the route to Washington was a tremendous mobilization. Young men marching to Washington, young men in uniform going to defend the Capitol, going to save the Union, and they hoped to end slavery, and that was a striking thing. And another thing, these troops, Massachusetts, as I said, had mobilized early. Troops were training at George's Island in Boston Harbor, at Reedville in Hyde Park, and military camps all around Boston. And one thing soldiers did then was sing. I mean, as you're marching along, it's a good way to keep time. And one regiment marching up State Street, actually a regiment led by Daniel Webster's son, came on by boat from George's Island, marched up State Street so they could march in front of the State House, and they were singing a new song that one member of the unit had written, a marching song, John Brown's Body. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. His truth is marching on. John Brown died so the slaves would be free. John Brown died so the slaves would be free. John Brown died so the slaves would be free. His truth is marching on. Popular song became, until the federal government forbid any soldiers to sing it, because this is not a war about slavery, and they don't want these troops going to Virginia singing how we're going to free all the slaves, because then that's going to kill the war for the Union. They were forbidden to sing it. Anyway, Mrs. Howe, getting back to Mrs. Howe and her husband are in Washington, and while he is off setting up the Sanitary Commission, she goes and sightseeing, and she goes actually to visit Massachusetts troops. She's one of the first women allowed to speak before groups of soldiers because she was a celebrity in Massachusetts. She's there to inspire the young men, which she does, and then they invite her to come see them training, somewhere west of Washington. She and some friends go out to watch the troops train, and apparently the Confederates had gotten the same invitation, and they interrupted the training by attacking this Union regiment that wasn't very well prepared, and the Union guys start retreating back to Washington. And of course, Mrs. Howe and her friends are in a carriage. They're riding along the side of the road, and as a way of cheering up these kind of bedraggled troops, they sing songs, including John Brown's Body. Now, the men couldn't sing it, but when they heard her singing it, they cheered, because they knew this is what the war was about. That night, Mrs. Howe is back in the hotel room, and she couldn't sleep. And she actually was a pretty good poet, but her husband thought poetry was silly. And why would she waste her time writing poetry? But if you write poetry, you probably don't want to admit it now, but Samuel Gridley Howe thought it was a silly thing. She got used to writing in the dark. And so she gets up and she finds a piece of hotel stationery, and she writes a poem that came to her. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah, glory, glory, hallelujah, glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His truth is marching on. He has preached a fiery sermon in the rows of burnished steel. As you deal with my condemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let this hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. His truth is marching on. She got back to Boston with this poem, and she knew the tune already. That is, she knew the tune of John Brown's Body, and she showed it to a friend who happened to be editor of the Atlantic Monthly, and it was published on the cover of their January 1862 issue, given the title, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, which it became. And this became one of President Lincoln's favorite songs. And it is the anthem of the war. And recognizing what the war was about and what it would cost. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. And it's a transformative moment, comparing this, of course, to the Passion of Christ. And then thinking about the rows of burnished steel. That's what the sermon is. And the watchfires of 100 circling camps. So, another Boston story for us.
That's very good.
Yeah. Okay, anything else about this monument?
And what's on the other side?
Well, let's take a look.
Side, yeah. And why didn't Phillips like it? What
Didn't
did they
say
got?
enough about slavery. These are the soldiers coming home. And as you can see, now the ladies of Boston have laurel wreaths to place upon their heads. Unfortunately, as you can see,
Those
their
who have
heads
them, yeah.
are gone. And as you can remember on the scene across, there is a woman with her child. Here is the child, grown now. The mother is back. So women, wives and husbands being reunited. The governor here to welcome them back as they're retiring their standards. The laurel wreaths being placed upon their heads. So this is the return from war. So we have going to war, we have the caring for the wounded, returning from war. I think we have one more side. So here we have some sailors and ships and leaving, going to war. Actually, this is a monitor. Sorry.
Okay.
A monitor, ironclad. Again, Boston, important port city. A lot of men from New England served in the Navy. And there you have it. So the four sides of Martin Milmore's monument to the Civil War, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. See, this was Earl.
Now I've seen it.
Now Professor Richmond has seen
Without
it.
the hem, yeah.
Without the hem. So, okay.
Okay, good.
So
yeah,
now
so just that one mention of slavery wasn't
Yeah,
enough.
yeah.
Yeah.